Hi, we complete our journey through Genesis 15 today as Abram is placed by God in a state of deep sleep and a deep and terrifying darkness descend upon him. And the text does something it never does elsewhere in Genesis and rarely does elsewhere outside the prophets. It breaks into the frame chronology to tell us something about the future in the story, but also a little bit about the future outside of the story. We've been looking throughout this chapter at the echoes of the Exodus in it. And of course, for the audience, the Exodus is as much in the past as Abraham is, long ago, hundreds of years before the listening or the few who might be in the reading audience. But what is not so far in the background is the Babylonian exile. And they may, in fact, still be in Babylonian exile at the time, which would make this story about Yahweh telling Abram that the time of oppression in Egypt would happen, but it would come to an end to give hope that the time in Babylon would also come to an end. If we follow the view of someone like Mark Brett that this book was finally finished in the Persian era, we can also extrapolate that even though the former Judahites were allowed to go and rebuild Jerusalem, they were still under foreign oppression. And perhaps it also is some hope that the time of the Persian evil in the sense of controlling the land that Yahweh had given directly to them would come to an end. So we'll see how that goes as we go through it. And we'll also continue to see the echoes between the first scene and the second scene, both in terms of the structure and shape of it and in terms of the key words. So you can see on the right side of the screen now we have the sections of that as I've been outlining throughout this chapter. Each of the color coding showing parallel elements of each of the scenes. So the red being something that God says will give to Abram, either a reward of this land. Abram's challenging question framed in both times in terms of, O Lord Yahweh, rare in Genesis and first here. Then in the green, Yahweh's telling him what will happen next, and then in the purple, doing something to Abram, and then in the brown, telling Abram what the promise or hope is, and then the response in the orange, as you see here at the bottom. We've also been looking at it in terms of key words, and if you looked at this one earlier or downloaded it from the web page, well, this is a revised version because I added the part you see in the orangey section there on give, because we have that twice here in Natan in Hebrew, and then we also have it here, but we also have it down here, highlighting a theme I've been looking at, which is how what follows in this chapter from chapter 14 echoes what happened in chapter 12 following chapter 11, which is to say in both situations, there's an element of imperial action in order to achieve something. In the Babel story, the building of a tower and a city in order to not be forgotten, in order to make their name great, and that's replaced in chapter 12 by Yahweh calling Abram and saying, I will make your name great. In chapter 14, it was Abram's violence and warfare which led to the return of possessions and the giving of land. And here we'll see that it's the gift of God that leads to possessions and land as an alternative. So parallel there. So let's jump into verse 13. We were continuing verse 12, and as Grossman noted, 12 to 17 form a nice, tight, simple chiasm here. So you can see the shape of that around the sun going down, and then the sun actually being down and dark at the end of it. So here, Yahweh says to Abram, know this for certain. And notice the form of that, the emphatic element of Yahweh telling this to him, even though this has nothing to do with what Abram was seeking. At the beginning of the chapter, what Abram is seeking is, O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me for I continue childless? And then when Yahweh promised countless descendants as the stars, and then said, I give you this land, he asked, how am I to possess it? So this is what's being told, but in the end it will describe possession, but only via the detour of the Exodus. So know this for certain, that your offspring, or your seed here, as we've been seeing, your seed, shall be aliens. Only one other time in Genesis, Ger, and note that that's the second half of the name of the person we'll meet in the next chapter, the Egyptian woman Hagar, or Hagar, which literally means the alien or the immigrant or the foreigner. It's not a name, and we'll see that in chapter 16. So a juxtaposition between these people becoming aliens or foreigners, and they're having a foreigner in their midst, and there'll be many connections. And guess what? She's from Egypt. So there should be aliens in a land that is not theirs. And notice the anonymity of the land here. We all know it's Egypt, but Abram doesn't know that. And there's no reason for Abram to know what any reader or listener to the Bible knows, because repeated so many times in the Bible is, I'm Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Unlike in this chapter, I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. But it also allows for enough ambiguity that for the audience it could be Babylon as well, even though all the elements here are specifically of the Exodus. So this quote, prediction of the Exodus that gives authority to God and a hope to the audience. A land that is not theirs, there shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. Let's look at this word here on the PL, and it's hard to pronounce without the vowels. But again, it's what Sarah will do to Hagar in the next chapter, highlighting that. And I also want to highlight two other specific examples of it. So let's look more closely at the two examples you see in my note pane down below. First from Exodus 1:11 here. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. So they're explicitly echoing the Exodus oppression. But let's also look at this one from 2 Samuel 7, and notice this is in the exact context of the promise that someone on the throne of David would always be there to reign over Jerusalem, and that was part of the covenant that in many ways, as we've been seeing, the memory of the patriarchal covenant we see here replaced in the post-monarchical period. And if you're not familiar with that, you can watch the last couple of videos where we went over some of that. So here we have this from 2 Samuel 7:10. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more, and evildoers shall afflict them no more as formerly. And shall afflict there is the same word here as oppress. So notice what that's suggesting, given the echoes that we saw of David in chapter 14, that Abram should not be like David, even though he was like David in chapter 14, and that is underscored here by this subtle echo of 2 Samuel 7:10, because of course there, evildoers shall afflict them no more, because of the promise of a military king like David who will keep them safe. But here, the end of oppression, which will come up in a few verses, is simply because of Yahweh's judgment on the evil nations. So relying on Yahweh versus relying on your own power of your hand and war, as we see. Such a consistent theme throughout Genesis. Many scholars have agonized over the fact that 400 years does not factually fit what we hear in Exodus 12:40, as you see in my note below 430. But I think anytime you're using years and such and numbers in general in the Bible as counting devices, you're likely to go wrong. 400 years is obviously a round number and not meant to be a specific chronological number. I doubt that 430 is exact number. In any event, most scholars would say the Exodus story itself is fictional. So in any event, we're not talking about a chronology of time. We're just talking about how two stories are inconsistent. And I'm not worried, are you, about whether Genesis rounds that to 400 years rather than making the exact number that we hear in Exodus. Notice in Acts 7:6 in the speech of Stephen, he also rounds it to 400 years, probably taking it from here as one of a number of those summary statements like we saw earlier in Nehemiah 9 and in the Psalms as well. So after the 400 years, we hear here, and as my note said, what I've already been saying, I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. And that's the key point, that Yahweh will bring the judgment, and afterward they shall come out, which is to say the Israelites, not the Egyptians, come out. One of our key words here, as we've been seeing, the coming out here, with great possessions. And this is the quiet one that was not obvious, because it's a new word here, Reshush, Reshush Gadol, with great possessions. It's a word only used late in the Hebrew Bible, outside the Torah, only in two places in Numbers. It's not in the entire Deuteronomistic history, which is from Deuteronomy to 2 Kings. And it's only in Daniel, Ezra, sorry for the typo there, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles elsewhere. But it echoes the key word in chapter 14, where it's used 4 times for possessions, the very possessions that Abram recovered by going after the nations that took Lot and his possessions captive. So here, again, echoing the sense that you can get back your possessions by force, as David so often did, and we saw the echo of that in the chart I posted of echoes of David, or you can do it because God's judgment will enable the people to be liberated and come out with their possessions, like they did from Egypt, as we saw in the chart here of echoes of the Exodus. And we can look back at that now. So we see this from Exodus 12 here. So they plundered the Egyptians with their silver and gold because Yahweh enabled them to, not because they fought a war against it. And I'll leave this up now because there are a number of other echoes of the Exodus in this section that we'll look at here. So now it turns away from the collective judgment to one little verse about Abram, and then returns back to the fate of the descendants. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. And I'm not going to speculate on the eschatological assumptions underneath that, whether that's suggesting an afterlife, something like we might see in Luke 16, where the rich man and the poor man both die, and the poor man finds himself in the bosom of Abraham, or as we hear in the New Testament, that we hear Jesus say that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as living. So perhaps those New Testament traditions are echoing something here, but it's really hard to know what was in the mind of Genesis authors for an afterlife here, because there's no further reference to this. It just seems like going to your ancestors in peace suggests dying and being among those of the past, rather than being in a particular place. But we can't know for sure. Then there's going to be a word play here between 15 and 16. Here he's in peace, beshalom, and I'll show you here, but the iniquity of the Amorites is not complete, lo shalem. Which is the verb form, here is the noun form, so complete or peace. So just as Abram goes to die in peace, the evil of the Amorites is not yet completed. You will be buried in a good old age. And in fact, he'll be buried at exactly the good old age of 175 years, which will be part of a little math problem we'll look at later when we complete our work in Genesis. And we look at the parallel of the ages of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And you can do that numbered game by yourself anytime you like. And then they shall come back here. And it's unclear what the here is. As we've been looking at, this whole scene seems to be taking place in the same place that Abram was when Melchizedek and the king of Sodom went out into the valley of Shaba to meet him after the war. Or is it simply in his dream, dark terror of the night state that he's in? No specific place is mentioned here. The word is henna, which is an unusual word for here. Often we hear Shem for here, the play on words on name and on Shem, like in the Shemites, the descendants of Adam. Here it's henna, and it's twice in this verse. There's another one at the end here which isn't translated. Notice it's a wordplay in vahenna, which is in 17 here, and behold, and it's almost never translated in New RSV. So a number of word plays linking these verses together. So they come back here in the fourth generation, and generation previously meant toledot, meant the generations we saw of the named descendants of a common ancestor, like the Shemites or like the Table of Nations. But here it's referring to a unit of time passing and lives passing. And as Sarna suggests, it's the sum of 4 lifespans rather than simply the transition between parent and child, which would somehow approximate the 400 years, although it depends on how long you think a lifespan is. Lifespans in Genesis are often longer than 100 years, but they certainly weren't for the audience, so we won't worry about the details of that. But let's look at the details of this, because there's something else important here. So the iniquity, literally the evil, the Avon of the Amorites is not yet complete. Amorites are used a number of times. Sometimes there are specific people, specific hill country people. We saw in chapter 14 they were Abraham's allies, or Abram's allies, in the fight against the kings that took Lot. But it's also a generic enough opponent to include Egypt and Babylon, maybe. They're not just Hamites, they're Canaanites. They're part of the larger group listed as Canaanites. And when we see the list of nations which the land is given to the Israelites in the end of this chapter, we'll see that some of those nations are ones we only know from that list. So it's unclear what's exactly going on there. So the chiasm closes, and Abram's mystical experience takes another step when the sun had gone down and it was dark. Alamah here, only here in the Torah, used in Ezekiel otherwise. And the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch, which I've noted here, are symbolic of the smoke on Mount Sinai and of the thunder and lightning on Mount Sinai when the people gathered there. So these small versions of it. And as people didn't pass, obviously, through the smoke, but in their covenant ritual, they had the blood of the bull poured on them. And so this is similar to that, with these sacrificial animals that he's between, and the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch passing between these pieces. As you can see in this image that highlights the darkness of the scene there. And there's another specification that's interesting and unusual between these pieces, as if there were other pieces to be concerned with. And I think that has the effect on readers of bringing us more closely into the scene, of making this alive and real and not just something about the past, those pieces, but these pieces. And let's look now at the last part of our scene, where the narrator changes the time situation from the immediacy of these pieces to the more generic on that day. And on that day we saw earlier with the flood, and it'll come up in the Exodus story in 8:22 and 13:8. Before we get further onto that, I do want to say one more thing about the injustice or the evil of the Amorites being complete. I realize I didn't complete that altogether. We saw on this chart, when we were looking back at righteousness, this passage from Deuteronomy 9:4-6. And we didn't look at it then, but I'd like to look at it now because it's implicitly in the background, and it says something really important about what this is saying about the Israelites in the land. So I won't read the whole thing, but it's repeated 3 times to emphasize it. When Yahweh your God thrusts them out before you, do not say to yourself, it is because of my righteousness, tzedakah, what was credited to Abram in verse 6, that Yahweh has brought me in to occupy this land. It is rather because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh is dispossessing them before you. Again repeated, it is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you are going to occupy their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations. And then it's repeated a 3rd time at the end here. And so that highlights here that when they get into the land, it's not because Abram has been such a model citizen or God's giving it to him as a reward, but because the Amorites no longer deserve it. So that implies that this isn't just acts of colonialism, that they're not just taking over the land of other people who are living there perfectly in peace, but they are replacing evil people, not because they're good people, because it makes a point of saying they're not, that they're hard of heart and stubborn, etc., but because perhaps they will do a better job because of their covenant with Yahweh than the nations that don't have a covenant with Yahweh. And it doesn't always happen, as we know, and the prophets denounce that, and that's, in the prophet's point of view, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel, why there was an exile. But it's also in Jeremiah and Ezekiel why the exile will end. Not because the exiles did such a good job of acting like good boys and girls, and so God is rewarding them, but because of the evil of the Babylonians. The Persians come along and defeat them. And one might ask a similar question to the Pharisees at the time of Jesus, who fought so hard to be pure in the hope that their purity would encourage God to send down a Messiah to defeat the Romans, and maybe it's simply because of the evil of the Romans and not because of the goodness of the Judahites, but that's for another story. So back to our text. On that day, Yahweh made a covenant with Abram. And notice it's separate from the covenant with Noah, but it's consistent with the covenant we'll see in chapter 17. And that's the point we've been looking at, that in many ways, after the monarchy, various texts like the Psalm 106 that we looked at tell a narrative, and Nehemiah 9 does the same thing, that replace the hope of monarchy with the hope of pursuing the life given to in the covenant of the patriarchs. And then we get to this incredible scene of land. And let's get this whole thing up there. To your sentence, I give this land, echoing what we heard from verse 7 when we noted we didn't know what this land meant, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, and then all these other places, people and places, many of which are only mentioned here. These are mentioned in the Table of Nations. So let's look at it from Google Maps here. I couldn't use my Bible Atlas because no Bible Atlas was big enough picture really to show all these places. And if we draw a line here to show you what this extends from, it's of course all the way from Egypt to Iraq, including Syria and Lebanon and all these other places that not even, I don't think, the most conservative defenders of the nation state of Israel today would claim would belong to them. But that's what this text is suggesting. It's certainly the widest claim altogether. And it ends with the Jebusites, because those are the people who had Jerusalem, and leaves a dark note because the Jebusites give up their land because David and his army invaded it. So the fact that this is listed as part of what Yahweh gives is ambiguous there, if much of what we're looking at is against the way of David and in favor of the way of Abram. So that completes our journey through chapter 15 and the chapters of Abram's wondering what the heck is happening. Now we're going to begin to get children, but first a child that doesn't satisfy Sarai. We'll see you for that next time. Bye-bye.